Subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon to get the latest updates.
Hello everybody, welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper reading. Today we shall be analyzing the Hindu newspaper dated 31st of July 2020 of the New Delhi edition. The topics to be discussed today has been displayed on a screen. Timestamping for the same has been provided in the description box below. Let us begin on today's discussion. Article appears on page number 11. This article shall be important mainly with respect to GS paper 2 governance under the subsection important aspects of governance, transparency and accountability. Now in case of India, whenever the general elections or the state assembly elections are held, the political parties are required to submit a report to the Election Commission of India giving details related to their funding and the expenses which they have incurred during the elections. Now, the political parties have submitted the report related to their expenses and funding during the Lok Sabha elections of 2019. Now, based upon such a report, an NGO known as the Association of Democratic Reforms has come up with an analysis of the funding and expenditure incurred by the political parties in India. And as the title of this particular article suggests, the BJP party accounts for almost around 54% of the Lok Sabha expenses incurred in the state of Uttar Pradesh. Now, as far as the UPSC exam is concerned, you have to focus on three important aspects. First and foremost, this particular report has highlighted that there has been delay in the submission of reports by almost all the political parties. Now, as per the rules laid down by the Election Commission of India, the political parties are required to submit the report within a period of 90 days after the conduct of the Lok Sabha elections. However, as pointed out by the Association of Democratic Reforms, there has been delay in the submission of reports. Accordingly, it has recommended that in future, if any political party delays in submitting the report to the Election Commission of India, then such political parties should be penalized. Secondly, presently there is a limit on the total amount of expenditure that can be incurred by an individual candidate who is contesting the elections. For example, as per the existing limit for the Lok Sabha elections in the bigger states, the expenditure limit on the individual candidate is 70 lakhs, whereas for the smaller state, the expenditure limit is 54 lakhs. However, please do note that this expenditure limit is applicable only to the individual candidates who are contesting the elections. However, there is no cap or the limit on the expenses that can be incurred by the various political parties. Now, as far as the limits on the individual expenditure is concerned, such a limit is basically laid down in order to create a level playing field between the candidates who are contesting the elections. However, since we are not laid on any kind of limit with respect to the political parties, we are not being able to create a level playing field between the various political parties. So it can so happen that a political party that gets huge amount of funding or a political party which has got deep pockets, such a political party can emerge as a winner as compared to a political party that gets less amount of funds. Accordingly, in order to ensure a level playing field between the various political parties in India, even the Election Commission of India has proposed for a cap or a limit on the expenditure that can be incurred by the political parties. The same has been reiterated even by the Association of the Democratic Reforms. Thirdly, in order to ensure transparency and accountability of the political parties, the Association of Democratic Reforms has stated that the details of all the donors to the political parties should be put in the public domain. Now, as far as the third aspect is concerned, this is quite important because presently there is lack of transparency in the political funding of elections. As you all must be aware, the political parties in case of India receive huge amount of funding from the corporate entities. So this funding of the political parties by the corporate entities leads to the nexus between the political parties and the corporates, and this has a potential to affect the policy making. So such kind of nexus between the political parties and the corporate entities can actually end up threatening the democracy in India. That is why we need to have a transparency in the political funding of elections, wherein the citizens of India need to be aware as to which corporate entity is funding which political party. Now, such kind of information, when made available to the Indian citizens, would help us prevent the politics corporate nexus. It will put an end to the corruption and thus promote more amount of transparency and accountability in the way the elections are conducted in India. Now, one way to ensure the transparency in the political funding of elections is to bring the political parties under the ambit of the Right to Information Act. It is to be noted that such a proposal to bring the political parties under the ambit of RTI Act has been in the agenda since almost last decade. However, if you look at the political parties, usually the political parties are divided along a number of lines and they normally keep opposing each other. But surprisingly, in case of bringing them under the RTI Act, the political parties have put up a united opposition and have been arguing that they should not be under the RTI Act. In this regard, as part of this particular video analysis, we'll understand the pros and cons of bringing the political parties under the RTI Act. Now, this particular demand to bring the political parties under the ambit of the RTI Act has been in the news since 2010. In the year 2010, the Association for Democratic Reforms filed for an RTI requesting the political parties to disclose information related to donations received by them. However, the political parties refused to disclose this information, wherein the political parties argued that they cannot be considered as the public authorities under the Right to Information Act, and because of which they are not under any obligation to disclose such an information. Now, if you look at the definition of public authority as provided under the RTI Act, the public authority here could be a constitutional body, that is a body created by the Indian Constitution. It could be a statutory body, that is a organization that has been created under the law of the Parliament, or any body which is substantially funded by the appropriate government, that is it can be funded either by the central government or the state government. So here the political parties counter argued that they are not set up by the Indian Constitution, they are not set up under the law of the Parliament, and they are not substantially funded by either the central government or the state government, and hence they cannot be considered as public authorities under the Right to Information Act, and thus they argued that they are not under any kind of obligation to disclose such a information. So because of the refusal of the political parties to disclose the information, the Association for Democratic Reforms then approached the Chief Information Commissioner. The Chief Information Commissioner in the year 2013 ruled that the political parties in case of India receive substantial amount of funding or the benefits from the government, and hence they can be considered as the public authorities under the RTI Act, and accordingly they need to disclose the information when an RTI request is placed. However, in order to nullify this particular judgment of the Chief Information Commissioner, the government then introduced the Right to Information Amendment Bill 2019. Now, such a bill was introduced in order to exclude the political parties from the ambit of the RTI Act. But fortunately, such a bill lapsed upon the dissolution of the 15th Lok Sabha. The crucial turn in this particular case came in the year 2019 when the Supreme Court delivered a landmark judgment in a case known as DAV College Trust versus the Director of Public Instruction. In this particular case, the Supreme Court stated that if a particular NGO is substantially funded by the Government of India, then such a NGO would come under the ambit of RTI Act. Now, based upon such a Supreme Court judgment, a petition was filed before the Supreme Court. In this particular petition, the petitioners argued that similar to how the NGOs are substantially funded by the government, the political parties also receive substantial amount of benefits from the government, and hence even the political parties should be considered as the public authorities under the RTI Act. Now, this particular petition is right now pending before the Supreme Court of India, and the matter as such is sub judice. Keeping this thing in mind, let us understand the arguments in favor and arguments against bringing the political parties under the RTI Act. With respect to arguments in favor, now the political parties have been arguing that they cannot be brought under the RTI Act since they are neither established by the Indian Constitution nor under any law of the Parliament, and hence they cannot be considered as a public authority. Now, this argument put forward by the political parties seems to be a flawed argument based upon the legal grounds without taking into account the spirit behind the definition of the public authority. See, in general, public authority should mean any authority that exercises substantial amount of powers which can affect the public at large. Now, the exercise of such powers could either be visible or invisible. Now, as far as the political parties are concerned, they are considered to be the invisible force in our democracy, and accordingly, they are considered to be vital for the overall smooth functioning of the democracy. For example, the political parties choose the candidates for the contesting of elections. The political parties issue the party whips. So if any member does not follow the party whip, then such a member stands to be disqualified as per the anti-defection law. Similarly, the political parties also find a mention in number of parliamentary conventions. For example, usually the Speaker of the Lok Sabha is from the ruling party, whereas the Deputy Speaker is from the opposition party. Similarly, the political parties are given proportional representation in the parliamentary committees such as the Public Accounts Committee, Estimates Committee, and so on. Similarly, if you look at the Public Accounts Committee, usually the chairperson of the Public Accounts Committee is from the opposition party. So as you can see here, even though the political parties are not established by the Indian Constitution nor under any law, the political parties as such are considered to be quite vital for the functioning of a democracy. So based upon such an argument, we can say that the political parties have to be brought under the ambit of the RTI Act in order to ensure greater amount of transparency and accountability. Secondly, it can also be counter-argued that the political parties as such get huge amount of government benefits such as free land, free office space, free airtime on All India Radio, Doordarshan, etc. They are also given the tax exemption. So in a way, the political parties are also substantially funded by the government of India. So just like how the NGOs have been brought under the ambit of RTI Act, even the political parties can also be brought under the RTI Act. Thirdly, presently there is huge amount of opaqueness in the funding of elections. This can be seen from the fact that almost 35% of the donations to the political parties is mainly made through the black money. And further, we have also seen as to how lack of transparency and accountability in the funding of political parties is threatening the Indian democracy. And lastly, bringing the political parties under the RTI Act would improve the public trust and confidence in the functioning of the political parties. As far as the arguments against bringing the political parties under the RTI Act is concerned, the political parties have been counter-arguing that the RTI applications can be misused by their political opponents in order to disclose information related to the internal functioning of the political parties. Now, for example, let's say a particular political party has chosen a candidate A for contesting elections in a particular constituency by taking into account the caste-based equations in such a parliamentary constituency. Now, this is an internal decision that has been taken by the political party, and such kind of information should be treated as a sensitive information. Now, if such a information is made available to the other political parties through the RTI, then this can in turn affect the overall functioning of the political parties in India. Thirdly, the political parties are already disclosing the necessary information on their finances to the Income Tax Department under the IT Act. And accordingly, the political parties have argued that since they are already disclosing the necessary information to the Income Tax Department, there is no explicit reason for bringing them under the Right to Information Act. Now, taking into account both the arguments and counter-arguments, we can come to a conclusion that bringing the political parties under the RTI Act would lead to immense benefits for our Indian democracy. It would improve the transparency and accountability. It will minimize the nexus between the political parties and corporate entities. It will also reduce the political corruption, and overall it will lead to the strengthening of Indian democracy. Now, based upon our analysis, a main question for your practice here could be the failure to bring the political parties under the ambit of RTI Act would hamper the transparency and accountability in our electoral democracy. Discuss. The next article appears on page number 7 and is titled as "Should the government go easy on the telecom sector?" This article shall be important from the perspective of GS Paper 3 Economy under the subsection Indian Economy and Various Issues. Recently, in October 2019, the Supreme Court of India had delivered a landmark judgment as to what constitutes the adjusted gross revenue of the cellular companies such as Airtel, Vodafone, Jio, etc. Now, because of such a Supreme Court judgment, the cellular companies are required to pay almost around 1.47 lakh crore in the form of dues to the central government. Now, such a judgment of the Supreme Court not only has an adverse implications on the telecommunication sector, but it has an adverse implications on the entire Indian economy as well. Now, with respect to your upcoming prelims, you should basically understand as to what is the adjusted gross revenue of the cellular companies, the concept of the Universal Service Obligation Fund, and as far as mains is concerned, one should understand as to how the recent Supreme Court judgment would have an adverse implications on the entire Indian economy. Now, all of these aspects related to the Supreme Court judgment on the telecommunication sector has been discussed in quite detail in our DNS dated 17th of Jan 2020. So what I would do here is I would attach the previous DNS video for your revision. The adjusted gross revenue of the telecommunication sector simply refers to the total amount of revenue earned by the cellular operators. In the field of telecommunication sector, the way the AGR is calculated is extremely important. This is so because the AGR which is calculated in turn determines the various fees that the telecom operators have to pay to the central government. For instance, the 3% of the AGR is required to be paid by the cellular operators to the central government in the form of the licensing fee. 3% of AGR has to be paid by the cellular operators in the form of the spectrum usage charges, and 5% of AGR has to be paid in form of contribution to the Universal Service Obligation Fund. It is to be noted that the Universal Service Obligation Fund is actually a statutory fund which has been created under the Indian Telegraph Act. The main idea behind the creation of Universal Service Obligation Fund is that certain amount of profits earned by the cellular companies should be in turn used for increasing the tele density in the rural and the remote areas. So, whatever contribution which the cellular companies make to the Universal Service Obligation Fund is in turn used for increasing the telephone penetration in both rural as well as remote areas. Now, with respect to the revenue earned by the cellular operators, the revenue may be earned by the cellular operators both from their core activities as well as the non-core activities. The core activities for the cellular company would obviously be the revenue that it earns from providing the cellular and data services, whereas the non-core activities would be those activities that are apart from its core activities of providing cellular and data services. And the non-core activities could include the revenue which the cellular companies earn from the sale of mobile handsets, the revenue earned through the sale of assets, or the revenue earned by the cellular companies in the form of interest from the banks. Now, the issue between the central government and the telecom operators was over how should we calculate the adjusted gross revenue of the telecom operators. According to the government, the AGR should not only include the revenue earned from the core activities, but it should also include the revenue earned from the non-core activities. On the other hand, the telecom operators argued that the AGR as such should include only the revenue which it earns from the core activities. Now, if the adjusted gross revenue is calculated according to the government's argument, then the AGR obviously would be higher. And as the AGR increases, then the amount of fees that the cellular companies have to pay to the union government, these fees would also increase commensurately. That is, the cellular operators would be required to pay a higher amount of licensing fee, a higher amount of spectrum usage charges, and a higher amount of contribution to the Universal Service Obligation Fund if the AGR is calculated according to government's proposal. Because of this, the telecom operators were arguing that the AGR should take into account only the core activities and it should not take into account the non-core activities. So since there was a difference between the government and the telecom operators on what constitute the AGR, the matter was then referred to the Supreme Court of India. Now, in a landmark judgment in October 2019, the Supreme Court has stated that the adjusted gross revenue would include the revenue earned from both core activities as well as the non-core activities. In other words, the Supreme Court has upheld the government's proposal and it has rejected the proposal put forward by the telecom operators. Further, the Supreme Court ruling as such would be applicable from the year 2005 onwards, which means to say that apart from paying these three different types of fees, the telecom operators are also required to pay the penalties and interest since the year 2005. So, if you add up the licensing fee, the spectrum usage charges, the contribution to USOF, along with the penalties and interest, this would add up to almost up to 1.47 lakh crore for all the seller companies based in India. Now, with respect to adverse implications of the Supreme Court decision, first and foremost, the Supreme Court decision would have an adverse impact on the financial position of the seller operators. Now, over a period of time, due to the over competition in the telecommunication sector, most of the seller operators have been forced to reduce their call as well as the data rates. So because of such reduction in the call and data rates, the overall revenue earned by the seller operators has got reduced. And on top of that, now the seller operators are required to pay an amount which is almost equal to 1.47 lakh crore to the union government. So going forward, the financial position of the seller operators is set to worsen further. Secondly, as stated before, the seller operators are required to pay the penalties as well as interest, which would be calculated from the year 2005 onwards. Hence, the Supreme Court ruling as such would have a much higher impact on the older telecom players and it would have less amount of impact on the newer telecom operators. For instance, the Reliance Jio made an entry into the Indian telecom market in the year 2016. So the Reliance Jio would be required to pay the penalties and interest only from the year 2016 onwards. However, the other companies such as Airtel and Vodafone, these companies would be required to pay penalties and interest from the year 2005 onwards. Thus, the financial position of the older telecom operators would get more adversely affected as compared to the financial position of the newer telecom operators, because of which some of the experts have pointed out that the Supreme Court decision may lead to the monopolization of the telecommunication sector in future. So in future, the telecommunication sector in case of India may come to be dominated by only 2 to 3 telecom operators. Thirdly, most of the telecom operators have taken huge amount of loans from the various banks within India. According to some of the estimates, the various telecom operators owe around 7 lakh crore to the various banks. And now the telecom operators are required to pay almost up to 1.47 lakh crore to the union government. Hence, because of which it has been stated that the overall ability of the telecom operators to repay back the loans to the banks would reduce, leading to an increase in the non-performing assets of the Indian banks. Nextly, the higher financial burden imposed due to the Supreme Court judgment may be in turn passed on to the consumers in the form of increase in the tariffs on the call as well as data rates. Thus, the increase in the call and data rates would have in turn adverse implications on the Indian consumers. And lastly, presently most of the seller operators are making investment in new age technologies such as the 5G technology, IoT, that is the Internet of Things, big data, and so on. Now, all these technologies are extremely critical from the perspective of Indian economy because these technologies in turn would give a thrust to the Industrial Revolution 4.0. So going forward, due to the higher financial burden imposed on the telecom operators due to the Supreme Court decision, the telecom operators may not be able to make adequate amount of investment in the new age technologies.
and lack of investment in the new age technologies would in turn have setback to India's efforts to usher in Industrial Revolution 4.0. Now, based upon our video discussion, a main question for your practice here could be the recent Supreme Court judgment on the adjusted gross revenue of the telecom operators would have adverse implications not only on telecommunication sector but also on the entire Indian economy. Elucidate.
Now, the next article appears on page number 6 and is titled as Getting Ahead of the Constitutional Practices. The article shall be important mainly from the perspective of GS Paper 2 Governance. Now, this article has appeared in the newspaper in the context of the political drama which is unfolding in the state of Rajasthan. Now, we have regularly been covering news related to legal and constitutional challenges that have arisen over the disqualification notices served to the rebel Congress MLAs. In our DNS dated 17th of July 2020, we had discussed that the Speaker of Rajasthan State Assembly had served the disqualification notices to the rebel Congress MLAs. So this serving of disqualification notices was then challenged before the Rajasthan High Court. In our DNS, we had presented both arguments as well as counter arguments related to the disqualification of the rebel MLAs. We had also looked into various provisions of the anti-defection law. We had also looked into various interpretations of the Supreme Court with respect to the 10th schedule. So the first two aspects related to the legal and constitutional challenges over the anti-defection in Rajasthan were covered in our DNS dated 17th of July 2020. Then in our DNS dated 23rd of July, we had discussed that the Rajasthan High Court had asked the Speaker not to continue with the disqualification notices and thus ordered the status quo. Then in our DNS dated 29th of July, we had discussed that the recommendation of the Rajasthan government to the governor in order to convene the Rajasthan State Assembly was rejected thrice. Now, this recommendation of the Rajasthan government was rejected by the governor on the grounds of the 21-day gap norm that is normally followed. This 21-day gap essentially means that there should be at least 21 days gap between the summoning and the actual commencement of the session. So earlier the Rajasthan government had recommended the governor to convene the assembly on 31st of July, but this was rejected thrice by the governor on the grounds that this violated 21-day gap norm between the summon and the actual commencement. So since the proposal of the Rajasthan government to convene the assembly on 31st of July was rejected by the governor, then the Rajasthan government recommended the governor to convene the assembly on August 14 and same has been accepted. And now the Rajasthan Assembly would be convened on August 14. Now the lead article that we are going to discuss here basically highlights that there has been violation of both constitutional as well as judicial norms in the recent political drama which is unfolding in the state of Rajasthan. So let us understand as to how the well-established constitutional, legal and judicial norms have been violated. Now as far as these points are concerned, you can use these points as fodder points in mains in a number of topics. For example, you can use a point related to intervention of courts in order to substantiate about the separation of powers between the executive and judiciary. Similarly, with respect to summoning of the assembly, you can use this particular point in order to highlight the nature of relationship between the governor and the state executive. Similarly, with respect to the rules of procedure in Lok Sabha on the anti-defection, you can use this point in order to have a critical analysis of the way the 10th schedule is functioning. On a broader level, you can include these points in the essay in order to highlight as to how various constitutional, legal and judicial norms are being violated in India. Now coming to the first point here, that the rules of procedure in the Lok Sabha for the anti-defection, that the same rules as such are followed even in the state legislatures for the disqualification of the MLAs under the anti-defection law. Now under these rules, any member of the House can file a petition before the Speaker for the disqualification of another member who may have violated the provisions of the 10th schedule. However, in this particular case, the Speaker does not take the action immediately. Rather, the petition is then forwarded to the member whose disqualification is being sought. So such a member is required to give his response within a reasonable time frame. So based upon the principles of natural justice, the Speaker then decides whether to disqualify such a member or not. Now in case of Rajasthan, the Speaker as such had only forwarded the petition to the rebel Congress MLAs.
So in a way, the speaker as such had only issued the show cause notice, and he had not actually decided on the disqualification of the members. However, in spite of this, a petition was filed before the Rajasthan High Court challenging the speaker's decision to forward the petition of the rebel Congress MLAs. Now here, the speaker as such had acted in accordance with the rules which have been laid down. So ideally, the mere act of forwarding the petition or serving the show cause notice cannot be challenged in the High Court. Secondly, in the Kyoto Holohan case, the Supreme Court of India had ruled that the speaker acts as a tribunal when he is deciding on the disqualification of the members under the 10th schedule, and hence the decision of the speaker is subject to judicial review. However, at the same time, the Supreme Court stressed on the point that the judicial review would come into being only when the final decision is taken by the speaker. That means the judiciary as such cannot intervene when the speaker is yet to decide whether to disqualify a particular person or not. However, as you can see in case of Rajasthan High Court, there has been clear violation of the Supreme Court's judgment in the Kyoto Holohan case. Now in this particular case, the Rajasthan High Court has not only intervened even before the matter is decided by the speaker, the Rajasthan High Court has also asked the speaker to maintain status quo with respect to disqualification notices. So once again, as you can see here, the Rajasthan High Court has not followed the Supreme Court's judgment in the Kyoto Holohan case. The next aspect is related to the summoning of the assembly, which is provided under Article 174 Clause 1. Under this particular article, the governor is required to summon the state legislature. However, while issuing the summons to the state legislature, the governor has to keep in mind that the maximum time gap between the last sitting in one session and the date appointed for the first sitting in the next session should not exceed 6 months. But the question which arises here is whether the summoning of the state legislature, whether it is a discretionary power of the governor or not. In other words, whether the governor is required to act in advice tendered by the Council of Ministers headed by the Chief Minister to summon the assembly. So in order to provide clarification whether the summoning of the assembly, is it a discretionary power of the governor or not, the Supreme Court in the famous Nabam Rabia case has held that under Article 174, the summoning of the assembly is not the discretionary power of the governor. Rather, in this particular case, the governor is required to act upon the aid and advice of the Council of Ministers headed by the Chief Minister. Similarly, in the famous case known as the Shamsher Singh versus State of Punjab, the Supreme Court has also stated that the governor has no right to refuse to act on the advice of the Council of Ministers. Now, with respect to what has happened in the state of Rajasthan, as stated before, earlier the Rajasthan government had recommended the governor to convene the assembly on 31st of July. However, this recommendation of the Rajasthan government was rejected at least thrice by the Rajasthan governor. Lastly, as highlighted before, presently a 21-day gap norm is followed. Under this 21-day gap norm, usually a minimum of 21 days is considered as a gap between the summon and the actual convening of the assembly. Now, this 21-day gap norm is neither a constitutional requirement nor a statutory requirement. Rather, it is basically a precedent that has been followed in order to ensure the smooth functioning of the legislature. So, since it is a precedent, it is generally followed. But at the same time, this 21-day gap norm has never acted as a constraint for the government to convene the assembly at a shorter notice. In fact, the rules formulated by the Rajasthan State Assembly itself provides for the convening of the assembly at the shorter notices. So, if the government feels the urgency, then the government is well within its power to convene the assembly at shorter notices. However, as seen in case of Rajasthan, the governor has overruled the decision of the cabinet with even regarding the date of convening of the assembly. So, in spite of the flexibility given to the government to convene the assembly at the shorter notices, the governor as such did not accept the recommendation of the cabinet.
So this in turn sets a dangerous precedent and may lead to a future deadlock between the office of governor and the state cabinet. These are some of the important aspects which you should know with respect to this particular article. Now in today's newspaper, we have two articles on page number 6 dealing with the recently unveiled National Education Policy 2020. Now the various aspects related to National Education Policy has already been discussed in our yesterday's DNS. So what we would do in this particular video analysis here is we will understand as to what are the present deficiencies in our education system and how these deficiencies are sought to be rectified by the newly unveiled National Education Policy 2020. Then we shall also discuss as to why the implementation of this particular policy would be challenging for the government of India. Now, the various points that we are going to discuss here can be used by you in order to highlight as to how the new education policy is an improvement over the existing education policy and what more needs to be done in order to address the various challenges with respect to the education sector. Firstly, as part of our analysis, we'll focus on the school education system first and then we'll go on to the higher education system. Now, with respect to school education system, we have seen a phenomenal increase in the gross enrollment ratio in the school education. However, the learning outcomes as such has continued to remain poor. The same was highlighted by the Annual Status of Education Report 2019, which was recently published in the month of Jan 2020. Now, as you can see in this particular graph here, the gross enrollment ratio at various levels of school education has increased. For example, with respect to primary education for the classes 1 to 5, the gross enrollment ratio has increased to almost around 99%. In case of secondary education also, it has increased to almost around 80%. Now, one of the main reasons for the poor learning outcomes in case of India is lack of emphasis on the children, especially during the formative age of 3 to 6 years. Now, as you all must be aware, the children are required to be provided for the education in the age group 6 to 14. As far as the children of the age group 3 to 6 is concerned, these children as such are needed to be provided with the pre-primary education. However, the lack of emphasis on the pre-primary education has in turn led to the poor learning outcomes when these children enter into the formal education system upon attaining the age of 6. It is normally seen that most of the children who enter the formal education system at the age of 6, such children are not exposed to the early childhood education in the age groups 3 to 6 years and hence lack the readiness for school. Now, in order to address the problem of the learning outcome, the National Education Policy has sought to replace the present 10+2 curriculum structure with 5+3+3+4 curriculum structure. Now, this particular curriculum structure corresponds to the age groups of 3 to 8, that is the education for 5 years, the age group of 8 to 11, the age group of 11 to 14 and 14 to 18. So in a way, it sees education as a continuum with due amount of emphasis on the children, especially during the formative years of 3 to 8 years. The second problem with respect to the present school education system is that we have not adequately focused on the vocational training. This is in turn evident in the lack of low-level skill set among the Indian workforce. Now, for example, as per the Economic Survey 2019-20, only 13% of India's workforce in the age group 15 to 59 has received some amount of training. Out of this 13%, only 2% of workforce have received the formal training. So the remaining 11% of India's workforce have actually got the informal training. So as you can see, the overall level of formal training in case of Indian economy has remained quite poor, and this can in turn prevent us from harnessing the demographic dividend. So in order to address this particular problem, the National Education Policy has given due emphasis on vocational training along with the internship. Nextly, presently there is lack of emphasis on imparting primary education in the mother tongue. So this has not only led to the considerable burden on the children but also affected their overall learning outcomes as well. So in order to address this particular problem, the National Education Policy seeks to provide for the primary education in the mother tongue until at least class 5, but preferably until the class 8 and beyond. Nextly, as you can see here, even though we have been able to achieve a substantial increase in the gross enrollment ratio, the dropout rate, especially in the secondary education, has remained quite higher. So as you can see, the overall dropout rate is quite higher in the secondary education as compared to the primary education. So the higher dropout rate in the secondary education essentially means that less percentage of children are making the transition from the primary education to the secondary education. So this problem has to be rectified in order to ensure that from the secondary education more number of children or the youths transition towards the higher education. So in order to address the problem of the higher dropout rate in secondary education, the National Education Policy envisages 100% gross enrollment ratio in the school education by the end of 2030. Nextly, as far as the midday meal scheme is presently, only one-time lunch is being provided to the students. Now the National Education Policy has decided to provide for a energy-filled breakfast in addition to the midday meal in order to ensure the higher enrollment of the children in the school education. Plus, it would also lead to the better learning outcomes. And lastly, periodic inspection of the schools has led to the higher compliance burden and has provided scope for the corruption. To address this particular problem, the periodic inspections has been replaced by the self-assessment and the voluntary declaration. Now, with respect to higher education, presently the gross enrollment ratio in the higher education, as per the All India Status on Higher Education report, stands at almost around 26.3%. However, it is much lower as compared to other countries. For example, in Malaysia, it is almost 45%, and in South Korea, it is as high as 94%. Accordingly, the National Education Policy has set a target to increase the gross enrollment ratio in the higher education to 50% by the end of 2035. The next problem with respect to higher education is the over-regulation of the higher educational institutions. Now, in case of India, all the universities are presently regulated by the University Grants Commission. Then the colleges as such need to be affiliated with the universities, and then the courses as such are regulated by the professional councils. For example, in case of engineering education, it is regulated by All India Council for the Technical Education. Hence, in order to address this particular problem, the National Education Policy has sought to create the Higher Education Commission of India as a single umbrella body for undertaking the development of the higher education. Now, the Higher Education Commission of India will undertake its operation through the four verticals: the National Higher Education Regulatory Council, which will be regulating the higher education; the General Education Council for the standard setting; the Higher Education Grants Council for the funding of the higher education; and lastly, the National Accreditation Council for undertaking the accreditation. Nextly, barring some of the colleges such as the IITs and IIMs, most of the colleges across India do not have the sufficient amount of autonomy. Hence, in order to address this particular problem, the affiliation of the colleges to the universities will be phased out in the next 15 years. And lastly, if you look at the universities in other countries, particularly the universities in America, they not only focus on imparting education, but they also give due amount of emphasis on the research work as well. However, in case of India, the Indian universities have not given due emphasis on research. Hence, in order to promote the research within the Indian universities, the National Education Policy has proposed to set up the National Research Foundation, which will in turn support the Indian universities to undertake the multidisciplinary research. So if you look at the National Education Policy 2020, undoubtedly it is quite ambitious in terms of its objectives. However, the two main challenges that could be faced with respect to implementation of this particular policy is, first and foremost, the National Education Policy has sought to enhance the overall expenditure on the education to 6% of India's GDP. Presently, the combined expenditure of the center and states on the education is around 3.1% of India's GDP. Hence, in order to meet the target, we would have to double our overall expenditure on the education. Now, this seems to be quite a challenging task, particularly when the tax to GDP ratio is declining. Secondly, as you all must be aware, education is a subject that has been placed under the concurrent list. Hence, in order to ensure the success of this particular policy, center and the states need to set aside their differences and work in the spirit of the cooperative federalism. However, this seems to be quite a difficult task. Now, for example, the proposal to set up the Higher Education Commission of India may be opposed by some of the states. So these are some of the important aspects which one should know with respect to this particular article. The next article appears on page number 15 and is titled as Gold Demand Falls to 11-Year Low. Now, recently, World Gold Council has published a report. As per this particular report, the gold demand within the Indian economy has reduced to a 11-year low. This reduction in the gold demand is mainly on account of lockdown as well as the high gold prices. Now, as far as your prelims is concerned, you should have a basic idea about the World Gold Council. Now, the World Gold Council is an association consisting of the world's leading gold mining companies. It helps to support its members to mine the gold in a responsible manner. Now, there are growing concerns that the newly mined gold as such can be used to finance the armed conflicts across the world. Thus, there is a need to ensure that the gold that is sold in the market does not indirectly finance such armed conflicts. In this regard, the World Gold Council has developed the conflict-free gold standard to help the companies to provide assurance that the gold which they are selling is not indirectly contributing to any kind of armed conflict. So the conflict-free gold standard basically provides an assurance to the customers that the gold which they are buying has been extracted in a manner that does not cause, support or benefit the unlawful armed conflict or contribute to serious human rights abuses. Now, similar to conflict-free gold standard that has been developed by the World Gold Council, we have the Kimberley Process Certification Scheme for the diamonds. So just like how the conflict-free gold standard provides an assurance that the gold is not contributing to the conflict, the Kimberley Process Certification provides an assurance that the diamonds that are being sold in the market are not indirectly financing the wars against the legitimate governments. Now, this Kimberley Process Certification Scheme becomes quite important for your upcoming prelims examination because India had assumed the chairperson of the Kimberley Process Certification Scheme in Jan 2019. The next article appears on page number 14 and is titled as Gandhi King Initiative Passes the US House Committee. As the title of the article highlights, an important committee in the US House of Representatives has approved a bill in order to highlight the work and legacies of Mahatma Gandhi as well as Martin Luther King Jr. Now, the bill will establish annual student exchange programs. As part of this particular program, the students would get to study the work and legacies of Mahatma Gandhi and civil rights leader Martin Luther King. As part of such a program, the students would visit the historic sites in India and US relevant to India's freedom struggle and US civil rights movement. The bill also seeks to establish the Gandhi King Global Academy. Now, this is an academy that will work at conflict resolution based upon the principles of the non-violence. Then the bill seeks to establish the US-India Gandhi King Development Foundation. Now, this foundation would be set up by the US Agency for the International Development and the Government of India. This foundation would have a budget grant of almost around $30 million per year, and this grant will be in turn used for financing the NGOs that work in the field of health, pollution, climate change and so on. Now, coming to the question for the day, the question here is consider the following statements related to the Universal Service Obligation Fund. The first statement is it was set up to an act of parliament to improve the telecom services in the rural areas. The second statement is the financial resources for this fund are raised through universal service levy of 5% of the adjusted gross revenue of the telecom service providers. Which of the statements given above is or are correct? With respect to the answer for the question that was asked in yesterday's DNS, the answer was B, that is 2 and 3 only. The first statement here was wrong. This is because it is a rare sandstone idol which was stolen from the state of Rajasthan.